Yo, what is up, guys? Snap here. Today we're going to be talking about the brand new support build we're going to be playing in the 325 Settlers of Kalgur expansion for Path of Exile. Now, as you can see on screen here, the carry build we played for last league was, of course, Blink Arrow, Mirror Arrow. And this build is quite powerful in the current patch, and there's a few advantages it has. Mainly, it is a minion build so that we can benefit from the extra quantum rarity from Wind Ripper, but also it can ignore penetration entirely via the chest Fleshcrafter. Specifically, the line that reads, while minions have energy shield, their hits ignore monster elemental resistances. Now, historically, in group play, you have always played a cursebot, and historically, the big advantage a cursebot brings has always been a gargantuan amount of penetration via pen curses like elemental weakness, despair, those kind of things, right? But with the introduction of all the additional map effect modifier GGG has added to the tree, in addition to all of the nerfs curses have received the past few patches, it is very easy to make a map where it's basically impossible to penetrate elemental resistances to zero. And so building around the chest becomes a lot more convenient and a lot easier to get damage out of. So this begs the question, what do you do with the curse spot? Because yes, you can put on temp chains and enfeeble and maybe punishment, but the penetration curses no longer do anything. You can slap on additional utility like skitterbots, but like they don't do a whole lot. So this character honestly has been getting grinded down and it's becoming less and less useful over the years. And so I began looking for a replacement to the curse spot because honestly, it is just not pulling its weight in the party these days. And I think there is definitely something better. I looked through a bunch of different utility that you can bring to the party, including war cries, stunning the screen with a bunch of CDR tattoos. This idea was horrible, albeit funny. You could screen wide stun the screen and knock them back with Debion's Dirge, coupled with a bunch of war cry CDR tattoos. You could have a consistent screen wide stun. This was an option I was considering. I tried making a bone chiller shockbot type thing that was just proccing Call of the Void for a giant amount of, extra cold damage taken. This would theoretically provide a lot of defenses and offenses, but there are unfortunately some culling issues here that you run into, and this build isn't really a viable pathway. But today we are debuting the new support we are replacing the curse bot with, and that is going to be a Spectre bot. Now, this is going to be taking a lot of explaining because there's a lot of new technology that's being introduced here you may or may not know about, and there's a ton of utility packed into this character that honestly supersedes any curse bot you could build in the past league or two. So the idea is you can summon a bunch of specters that do a lot of stuff for your party. You put on the Wraithlord helmet, get a bunch of specters, and you can summon a bunch of utility. Now, what is the best specter you could possibly summon? And that, of course, is an Undying Evangelist. Evangelists have a proximity shield that is up for 8 seconds and has a cooldown of 18 seconds. And this is what it looks like in game when you get 8 of them. As you can see, you have a ton of coverage with the bubbles and you have basically 100% uptime on them, which I can get to a little bit later. But the thing you need to know about these is that you are completely immune to damage that is originating outside of the bubble. And if you have a bunch of overlapping bubbles here, the mobs need to be exactly inside all of those bubbles to even hit you with anything. The best way I can describe this to you is if you've ever come across a Harbinger that spawns a bunch of proc shields, right? Sometimes you need to weave into one very specific spot before you can even kill all of the proc shield mobs. Now you get to do that back to the monsters. This effect is extremely powerful, and it can even let you dodge stuff like Maven's memory game, as you can see here, because the explosion is originating from outside of the range of the bubbles. There are a few caveats you must know about this, however. This bubble will only apply to hits. It does not work with any sort of damage over time. So if you're getting Shaper Beamed, for instance, it will not work for stuff like that. But anything that is considered a hit needs to be originating from inside of the bubble in order for you to take any amount of damage. I mentioned earlier that the base duration is 8 seconds and the cooldown is 18 seconds. There's a few tricks you can use to get this to 100% uptime. The first thing to mention is that Enduring Bond here, which gives you minion duration, does not interact at all with the duration of the bubbles cast by the Undying Evangelist. The only way to give the bubbles duration is to link it directly to stuff like increased duration and efficacy. You can give them duration via the Malevolence aura, or you can give them duration via extra quality on Dialas. The Dialas here will bump up the quality on duration and efficacy, giving you enough duration to have 100% uptime here. You basically have to either use Malevolence or Dialas, and that is enough to get to 100% uptime on the Evangelist. And as you can see here, there's basically no downtime on the bubbles. You're going to be having 100% uptime on all of these. There is one thing to mention about the minion AI, and that is that they will always always prioritize attacking nearby mobs instead of casting their bubble. So that means the bubbles will naturally desync, so they're not all recasting at the same time. However, it does introduce a problem in that if there is a mob nearby, sometimes all of your bubble boys will start attacking that one mob and not recast their bubble at all. But in general, the gameplay is very smooth, and usually the AI isn't a huge issue. You're going to have pretty high uptime on all of these bubbles anyways. So that's good and all. We have bubbles, but that is clearly not enough to fill a support slot in a party. But there is a lot more utility that is brought to the table via this character. This character is also providing a screen-wide AoE capped shock and chill at 40%. It is doing that via the Corpse Pact node. The Corpse Pact node shocks and chills nearby enemies with a floor value of 15% for the shock and 10% for the chill here. This combined with the Corpse Walker boots works together to automatically spawn corpses as you're walking around to create a floor shock of 15 and a floor chill of 10. It's completely automatic, and you can see as I just walk around, corpses are spawning around me. And as you walk around, you can see the stuff get shock and chilled as I'm just walking around. The AoE on this is quite large and is just barely not quite a screen. It's around 80 units, I believe, so it is quite large. It is not affected by increases to your character's area of effect. You scale this floor shock and chill value from Corpse Pact via a bunch of cluster jewels, which is deep chill and astonishing affliction on the mediums, as well as deep chill on the larges. You also anoint Ash, Frost, and Storm over here for additional ailment effect. All of this together gives your character a capped 40% chill from the Forbidden Flesh and Flame nodes, because we're taking the Shaper of Winter Ascendancy node, and then also a capped shock at 50%, which is a 50% increased damage taken modifier, which is very significant and helps out a lot on single target because it's hard to ramp shock on single target, especially in a 6-man party. So we have all of the Spectres providing all the mitigation. We have a capped shock and chill, which is helping for defenses, and the shock is adding a good bit of damage. It still has the important defensive curses on Blasphemy, which is Enfeebled Temp Chain. There also is room to fit on a third curse, which would probably be Punishment, although it is not strictly necessary if you don't feel the damage is necessary. Just know it is an option to run a third curse here if you really want to. Ideally, you'd get a Corruption on the Jinx Juju for +1 curse. You would just corrupt and anoint Ash, From, and Storm afterwards. The last bit of utility, which you probably haven't seen before, is going to be a Stormbind totem. You might be asking, what the fuck is a Stormbind totem and what does it do? So if you're unaware, when you put down a Stormbind totem, it starts casting this Stormbind and it channels the squares on the floor and it covers the screen with these squares. Now, if you cast more than one totem, these squares will connect to the previous ones, and you can have a substantial amount of these squares covering basically multiple screens because they persist as long as one totem has kept channeling on the previous section of squares. The reason we care about Stormbind is it has a line that reads 50% reduced movement speed for basically mobs that are standing on those runes. Reducing monsters' movement speed in PoE is very good. It's a very good defensive layer, especially when you have ranged proximity shields that mobs need to get inside of to do damage. There is one last thing to mention here regarding movement speed reductions in regards to Stormbind totem, and that it is possible to reach 100% reduced movement speed of the monsters, and when you do so, monsters simply stop moving. As you can see here, when they're standing on the Stormbind, they simply just do not move. The AI just completely breaks on these, and they are no longer able to walk up and attack you. Now, granted, this is only when they are inside of the range of your Flesh and Stone, because it is your source of maim. You can imagine how this becomes a very powerful defensive layer in a party. The very last bit of utility this build brings to the table is going to be Calm's Binding, which converts 25% of the nearby monster's physical damage to fire in a very large radius. This is very good because you have 90% Aures, so converting any of the fizz damage you're taking to an element is going to be benefiting the whole party. This belt is very, very good. It's something we started using last league. It's definitely worth putting on somebody here. The rest of the build is going to be personal defenses. It has some classic support Aurabot type stuff going on. A Jinx Juju for the 10% damage to Spectres. It just builds a lot of ES to leverage party defenses. And it specifically has a Triad's Grip, converting all of the minions damage to elemental. The colors don't really matter here as long as it's not chaos. And then you're deleting all of that damage with void manipulation and links so that they don't deal damage, which means you can coal with them as well. Now, astute magic finders might notice a problem here in that these minions are hitting, which means that if if you want to use a Kingmaker and give everybody the culling aura, these two things are incompatible. There is a version of this build you can play without the helmet and instead equipping a Midnight Bargain. You lose 2 max minions, but you can instead wear a Shav's Wrapping. The defenses on this one are going to be a little bit worse. However, just know there is a variant of the build you can play if you want to use a Kingmaker in the party and you do want to leverage the rarity from Kingmaker. I'll include both versions of the build in the description. You can choose which one you want to follow in case you are or are not using Kingmaker. The rest of the build is going to be some pretty standard stuff. You have a pretty healthy armor ES pool here. You also have CI with, 80 cold res, 75 of the other 2 resistances here. You're stacking a ton of percent ES, which means you're going to be very high when you're in range of a Mana Guardian, and your minions are extremely tanky with 24k life here, as well as energy shield from the Mana Guardian and other party buffs. As for the helmet, you want to just get as much resistances, energy shield, armor, attributes, whatever you can here. Just defenses really matter here. The only other stuff you really want to get here is just Moonstone Crusader rings, again with just as many resistances as you can. But yeah, the gearing should be pretty straightforward here. As for the links here, of course, you're going to want to have Ray Spectre here linked to Meat Shield, Duration, Void Manip so it doesn't deal damage, and then Efficacy is necessary for the uptime on the bubbles. You can jam an additional utility here in the chest via Frost Shield. It helps soak some damage in a party. It's a very good link if you can spare it. You have Enfeebled Temp Chains in a 3-link on Blasphemy. You can put this in either the weapon or the shield. And then lastly, the links for Stormbind is going to be Stormbind, Spell Totem, Duration, Faster Casting. You have defensive auras in a 3-link here on the other weapon, and then you have an automation setup constantly casting Convocation, pulling your minions back, as well as giving you a ton of movement speed via Phase Run and Withering Step. Yeah, that goes over most of the build. It is essentially replacing most of the power of the cursebot, but it brings layer upon layer of additional utility we didn't have before, and I think it's going to be a very suitable replacement for the cursebot in party play. There's one last thing to talk about and kind of where this kind of build might fit in lower party sizes, like if you're doing a 3-man or a 4-man. Now, if you're 3-man, most likely the best bang for your buck is going to be playing a Mana Guardian. I do think a Mana Guardian provides more defenses via Soul Link than a character like this. However, there are some activities where you are stationary where a build like this might actually make you more tanky because the monsters aren't moving. Therefore, you're getting a ton of coverage with the bubbles. You can also reduce the movement speed a ton. Stuff like Ultimatum is very good with a build like this because you can essentially be completely immune to damage when you're inside the bubbles, and if you're not moving, the stationary Spellbind Totem as well as the minions are just going to be doing a ton here. As for 4-man groups, this is most likely going to be the most potent defensive addition to your party as a 4th character. If you want to add an offensive 4th person, you'd be adding a minor support. Most likely, you're going to be adding a culler instead, because if you have 4 people, you can most likely be culling, and that is definitely what you want to be doing. Although if you want to add player power, this would be the next best thing you'd want to add. So TLDR, you'd probably have a carry, you'd have an Orabot, of course, Mana Guardian 3rd, and then this build 4th, if not a culler. Yeah, that should about sum up the new support build that we're playing on the patch in replacement of the cursebot. I am going to be doing a separate video that's going over updates to all of the builds as a result of the patch notes, so just wait a few days for that. I'll hopefully get that out to you guys somewhat shortly after the patch notes here. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments. I try to answer most questions you guys might have. And once again, I'm Snap, and thanks for watching.